Silent Hills has been announced. There's Mikami's The Evil Within or Psycho Break. Then there's independent horror games like, Outlast or Amnesia or any number of indie horror games. So horror, it's back on the rise, and I'm curious what that means for the Resident Evil series.
Clearly this is going to have an effect, that horror is kind of back in vogue. And I think the key is going to be, making future games in this series with the idea in mind, with the understanding that users have played all these other games, that they know what kind of scares are in store there, and find some way to take that and build on it and continue to scare them and continue to surprise them. The more you know about horror, the less frightening it actually is. They already know about these other games. What can we do to add on top of that? How can we still surprise them and keep them on their toes? That's really going to be the key, I think, moving forward. Yeah, certainly this is going to have an effect on the future of the Resident Evil series. Personally, I think it's great that there's more and more horror games and survival horror games out there. I think it's good for stimulation. It's good to get us to think in different ways and think of ways to top that. What we need to do is make sure we're aware of all the things those games are doing, play them, research them, find ways to top them, find ways to make sure that Resident Evil remains kind of the brand at the top of the survival horror pile. So I think it'll be great. It'll be a good opportunity for us to really roll our sleeves up and get into some hardcore design work when it comes to the future of the series.
One thing that's a more recent development that is kind of helping take horror to a different level has been virtual reality like Oculus Rift or the Morpheus. Just personally, from a developmental standpoint, does that sort of VR opportunity excite you for horror?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm really stoked about the idea of virtual reality. I actually went to the team recently and said, hey, can you set up the mansion itself so that I can walk through with a VR helmet?
Oh my God.
They told me to take a long walk off a short pier. If we could do a remake of the remake of the remake, then we need to make that virtual reality. Yeah, speaking personally, I'm really excited about VR. I think it makes sense, having gone from 2D to 3D. Now it's time to kind of surround yourself in these worlds instead of just having a screen in front of you. It makes sense. The technology is there. There's going to be some really compelling stuff coming out on that, no doubt. It makes sense for a lot of game genres. I think it makes a special kind of sense for horror games, where immersion is more important than perhaps in other genres. I think we should most definitely start thinking about what we could do with that kind of technology in the future. It makes perfect sense.
Do you feel like Revelations, in part with the numbered series, is aiming to help Capcom sort of annualize the franchise?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw the game settling into that sort of cadence eventually in the future. The department in which I am employed, part of what we do and part of what we think about is exactly what we should do with the Resident Evil franchise moving forward. I don't think we'll see a change to the really big scale mainline games. I think once every 3 to 5 years probably makes sense for those, given the scale and the production schedules for those. I think by having spin-off series and some other elements, we may eventually be able to annualize. What we don't want to do is let the series kind of fall off the radar of gamers out there. We don't want it to feel like an old or stale or tired series that they haven't heard of in a few years. We want to make sure it keeps fresh in their minds. The last thing we want to do is have brand fatigue set in. There's only so many games people want to buy. I think it gets really complicated too in periods like this where we're kind of between generations and where cell phones are really taking off. The key is going to be really close communication with the fans, understanding what they want, finding a way to deliver that to them.
There are obvious roots of Resident Evil 4 still in Revelations 2. Curious, how long do you think it can go before the series needs to sort of reboot that gameplay structure?
Yeah, 4 did some really incredible things for us and for the industry. I think the reason that style of game is still popular among these games is it's such an easy-to-digest kind of format, the way it feels, the way it plays. For Resident Evil fans, it's kind of become the de facto style of gameplay when you think of Resident Evil. I do think it's a matter of time before we kind of reinvent the wheel again and come up with something like what we did before. Eventually, that'll have to happen. I think the good thing that a spin-off series like Revelations does for it is we get to kind of take a snapshot of a really good style of gameplay that people enjoy for Resident Evil and preserve that for a bit and iterate upon that and build upon that regardless of where the mainline series ends up evolving.
So the critical reception to Operation Raccoon City was kind of polarizing, but it sold well. I'm curious what Capcom's stance on working with Western developers for Resident Evil series might be currently.
Yeah, I mean, I think with something like Resident Evil, a big brand like that, I think it makes sense to continue finding the right partners to collaborate with. I think what we might see more of, as opposed to kind of wholesale development being left to another company, we might see more kind of pieces, parts being incorporated. Maybe we could find some technology that a Western company uses that we would like to incorporate. Maybe we could find a certain art style that a Western person has created and trying to incorporate that. I think what we'll see are these sort of piecemeal where we take, a portion of something that we like and work to incorporate it. We'll see more of that, and we'll probably see less full-on wholesale, leaving it to a developer overseas. And of course, those of us in Capcom Osaka, we feel pretty strongly, that the core of these games kind of need to be created and developed in Osaka, and then these other elements can kind of be glommed on.
What did the reception to Resident Evil 6 teach you about the franchise?
Yeah, I think, first of all, a lot of people played RE6, and that's great, and it's good to hear from them, because there are, certainly lessons to be learned there. One thing that's become really clear is that what people want out of the Resident Evil series is they want survival horror first and foremost. They want that to be the core of the gameplay, and then anything we add above and beyond that is great and probably welcome, but it really has to have that core intact. And I think the clearest lesson was Resident Evil needs to do is not compare itself to and try to compete with or try to be other big franchises. It needs to be itself. It needs to focus on what makes Resident Evil and expand further in the right direction. And that's certainly the message that we've heard loud and clear.
So fans might expect from future entries in the series, past revelations, a return to a focus on difficult enemies, scant resources, and true horror. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I mean, that's one avenue it could go. I think it's probably a little more complicated than that. I think what we really need to do is take a really serious look at what it is that makes Resident Evil. Look at all those constituent parts. If resource management is important to survival horror, why is it important? What does this mean? What do all these varying elements sort of mean to the franchise? How can we then take that and work with modern technology? I mean, since 6, we've got new consoles on the market. We have the potential for things like Oculus Rift and Morpheus, which you referenced earlier. How do we take all these technological tools available to us and take the data that we've learned from our careful analysis and really make something new and special? Figuring out what that is going to be a big challenge, but it's something we need to do. Yeah, one thing that's really worth mentioning, I think, here is that all of the Resident Evils that I've been involved in, and I think all of them we've made, clearly from the user's point of view, from 4 onward, it starts to feel, and I hear a lot that it feels more action-y. But one thing that I'd like people to keep in mind and to know really is that internally, our goal with all these titles has always been to maintain the genre of survival horror. I think we maybe looked at the concept of survival horror a little differently, depending upon the game, and maybe that is kind of the core of the problem, why some of them were received differently than others. Maybe we just haven't come up with the appropriate and fullest definition for what survival horror actually is. But I do want to assure you, maybe we didn't come across that way to the users, but our intent, even with 5 and 6, was to make a survival horror game. And I think the series will continue to move in that survival horror kind of direction. They've done a lot of analysis internally on why we think some of the more recent games haven't really been accepted that way. Right. Basically, what we really need to do is kind of come up with a definitive definition of that. And it's a definition that we would need to share and hold in common with the players as well. And once we have that, I think we can move in a solid direction that everyone's going to dig.
Do you foresee one avenue of future Resident Evil main numbered series continuing the storylines that have been established, or is there any discussion of starting something new?
Ultimately, that's going to be up to the specific team that creates whatever the next RE is. I don't want to step on their toes. Speaking personally, I think it would be cool to try something new. I'd be open to that, but I would also want there to be some link to what had come before, rather than going completely from scratch. But we'll see. That's not my team. We'll leave that to our guys up in Osaka and see what it is they come up with. It's exactly the sort of question they are currently figuring out. The team back in Osaka spends a lot of time and a lot of energy thinking about what the future of the Resident Evil franchise holds. They're hard at work doing that. I can tell you that the engine we used for Resident Evil Revelations 2, it is the 64-bit version of MT Framework. So it's multi-platform and multi-generational. At that, the future of the Resident Evil franchise may be best served by a special Resident Evil specific engine, perhaps. Maybe that's a direction we may end up going with that, but time will tell what the future holds.